The sound of champagne glasses clinking echoed from the living room as I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand still reaching for the doorknob I had been about to turn. Through the crack in the door, I could see my sister Natasha raising her glass high, her perfectly manicured nails catching the afternoon light streaming through my late father's, bay window. "To finally getting what we deserve," Natasha declared, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "That construction company, this beautiful house, all of it. Dad always knew I was the responsible one." My brother-in-law Cameron laughed, loosening his tie as he settled deeper into Dad's favorite leather armchair. "About time too. We've been waiting for this opportunity for years. Your sister never understood business anyway." The words hit me like a physical blow. Dad had been buried just 3 days ago, and here they were, celebrating in his house, dividing up his life's work as if I didn't exist. As if the 28 years I'd spent being his daughter meant nothing. "Zara always was the dreamer," Natasha continued, taking another sip of what I recognized as Dad's expensive champagne, the bottle he'd been saving for a special occasion that never came. "Art therapy degree working with troubled kids. So noble, so broke." She laughed, a sound that made my stomach turn. "While I built my marketing career and married a lawyer. Dad had to respect that kind of success." Cameron nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I've been researching the property values in this neighborhood. With the right renovations we could flip this place for at least double what it's worth now. The construction business alone is pulling in $500,000 annually." $500,000? Natasha's eyes widened. I knew Dad was doing well, but I had no idea it was that much. "Your father was smart with his investments too," Cameron said, scrolling through what looked like financial documents on his phone. "There are properties in 3 different states registered under the business name. We're looking at a multi-million-dollar inheritance here, baby." My legs felt weak. Dad had never talked about money with me. He'd paid for my college, helped me get my first apartment, but he'd never mentioned property investments or exactly how successful his business had become. He'd lived modestly, drove an old pickup truck, wore work clothes most days. I'd assumed he was comfortable but not wealthy. "The best part," Natasha said, settling onto the couch and kicking off her designer heels, "is that we won't have to share any of it. Zara never showed any interest in the business. She probably doesn't even know what Dad was worth." "Even if she did," Cameron added, "what could she do with a construction company? She can barely hammer a nail." "No, your father was practical. He knew who could actually handle this kind of responsibility." They spent the next hour going through Dad's house like they owned it, discussing which furniture they'd keep, which rooms they'd renovate first, and how quickly they could transition the business operations. Natasha even called her friend Rebecca, a real estate agent, to get a preliminary assessment of the property value. "The location alone is worth a fortune," she said into the phone, walking past the family photos on the mantel without a glance. "Prime real estate in the best part of town, and the house has been maintained perfectly." I watched her dismiss 28 years of memories with casual indifference. The kitchen where Dad taught me to make his famous Sunday pancakes. The workshop in the garage where I'd helped him build my first bookshelf when I was 12. The garden where we'd planted Mom's favorite roses after she died 5 years ago. To Natasha it was all just dollar signs. "What about the will reading tomorrow?" Cameron asked when she finished the call. "Just a formality, right?" "Absolutely," Natasha replied without hesitation. "Mr. Peterson has been Dad's lawyer for 15 years. He knows how these things work. Everything goes to the most capable child, and that's obviously me. Zara will probably get some sentimental items and maybe a small cash inheritance, but the real assets? The business, this house, the investments? That's going to someone who can actually manage it." "Your sister seemed pretty upset at the funeral," Cameron observed. "Of course she was upset. She lost her father. We all did." Natasha's voice took on a fake sympathetic tone. "But grief doesn't change reality. Dad made his choice years ago when he started involving me in business discussions and asking my advice about expansions. He never once asked Zara what she thought about anything important. That wasn't true. Dad and I talked every week, sometimes every day. But our conversations weren't about business. They were about life, about the kids I worked with, about books we were reading, about memories of Mom. I thought those conversations meant something. I thought I meant something to him beyond dollar signs and business potential." "Tomorrow's going to be interesting," Cameron said, refilling their glasses. "I almost feel bad for her. Reality is going to hit pretty hard." "She'll be fine," Natasha said dismissively. "Zara's always been the type to land on her feet. Besides, maybe this will finally motivate her to do something more substantial with her life than playing therapist to problem children." I'd heard enough. More than enough. I backed away from the door carefully, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. I made it to my car without being seen, but once I was safely inside, the tears I'd been holding back finally came. Dad had been gone less than a week, and my sister was already measuring his house for new curtains. The morning of Dad's funeral had been gray and cold, matching the hollow feeling in my chest as I stood beside his grave. But it wasn't the weather or even my grief that made the day unbearable. It was watching Natasha perform. She'd positioned herself at the center of every conversation, accepting condolences with the practiced grace of someone who knew she was being watched. Her black designer dress was perfectly tailored, her makeup flawless despite the tears she produced at exactly the right moments. Everything about her presentation screamed success, responsibility, the kind of daughter any father would be proud to call his heir. "Thank you so much for coming," she said to Mr. Henderson, Dad's longtime business partner, as mourners began to disperse after the service. "I know Dad would have appreciated seeing how much he meant to everyone. He was a good man, Natasha. Built something really special with that company of his." Mr. Henderson shook her hand warmly. "I'm sure he's left it in capable hands." "I hope so," Natasha replied with just the right amount of humble uncertainty. "I know Dad trusted me to carry on his legacy. The business meant everything to him." I watched from a few feet away as she seamlessly moved into what sounded like a prepared speech about Dad's work ethic and vision, while Cameron nodded supportively beside her. Several business associates gathered around, clearly impressed by her knowledge of the company's operations and future plans. "Zara, dear, how are you holding up?" Mrs. Rodriguez, our elderly neighbor, appeared beside me with kind eyes and a gentle touch on my arm. "I'm managing, thank you," I replied, grateful for her warmth after listening to Natasha's performance. "Your father was so proud of the work you do with those children," Mrs. Rodriguez continued. "He used to tell me about the kids who'd made breakthroughs in your sessions. Said you had a gift for helping people heal." Before I could respond, Natasha's voice cut through our conversation. She'd moved closer to where we stood, still surrounded by her audience of business associates and family friends. "It's going to be a big adjustment for all of us," Natasha was saying, her voice carrying clearly across the small group. "Inheriting Dad's business is a huge responsibility, but I feel ready for it. Cameron and I have been preparing for this possibility for years." The words hit like ice water. She was announcing her inheritance at Dad's funeral, in front of everyone who'd come to honor his memory. Several people glanced in my direction with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. "What about Zara?" asked Cousin Patricia, one of the few relatives who'd always treated both Natasha and me equally. Natasha's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, Zara will be fine. She's never been interested in the business side of things. Her talents lie elsewhere, working with children, creative pursuits. Dad always knew she'd find her own path." "But surely she'll inherit something?" Patricia pressed, clearly uncomfortable with the dismissive tone. "Of course," Natasha replied smoothly. "I'm sure Dad made provisions for both of us. But let's be realistic. I'm the one with business experience, the one who understands how to manage complex operations. Zara's wonderful at what she does, but running a construction company? That requires a very different skill set." Cameron stepped in to support his wife, his lawyer training evident in how he framed his words. "Zara's contribution to the family has always been more personal. Emotional support, creative input. Very valuable in its own way, just not suited to corporate leadership." I felt my face burn with humiliation. They were essentially calling me incompetent in front of half the town, and doing it with such polished professionalism that it sounded almost reasonable. Several people nodded along, clearly buying into their narrative that Natasha was the obvious choice for inheriting the business. "When is the will reading?" asked Mr. Peterson's secretary, who'd come to pay her respects. "Tomorrow morning," Cameron answered. "Just a formality, really. We expect everything to be straightforward." "Your father was always so organized," Mrs. Chen from Dad's church added. "I'm sure he made his wishes very clear." "Absolutely," Natasha agreed. "Dad was nothing if not practical. He understood that leaving a business to someone who couldn't run it would be doing a disservice to his employees and his legacy." More nods of agreement from the crowd. I realized that Natasha wasn't just announcing her expected inheritance. She was building a case for it, creating a narrative that would make everyone see her claim as not just reasonable but inevitable. "Zara's always been the artistic one," Natasha continued, finally acknowledging my presence with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So creative, so passionate about helping others. Dad used to say she got that from Mom, all heart, not much head for business." The comparison to Mom stung because it was partially true. Mom had been creative and caring, and Dad had loved that about her. But Natasha was twisting it into a weakness, suggesting that being like Mom somehow made me unfit to inherit Dad's life's work. "I think both your father's daughters have their strengths," Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly, her voice carrying a warning that she wouldn't tolerate any more dismissive comments about me. "Of course they do," Cameron said quickly, recognizing the disapproval in her tone. "We're not suggesting otherwise. We're just acknowledging that different people are suited for different roles. And some roles," Natasha added with another practiced smile, "require years of preparation and specific expertise. I've been working in marketing and business development for 8 years. I understand contracts, employee management, financial planning. Those skills don't develop overnight." What she didn't mention was that her marketing job was at a small local firm where she handled social media accounts for restaurants and beauty salons. Hardly the corporate leadership experience she was implying. But her audience didn't know that, and she was counting on them not to ask for details. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Natasha smoothly deflecting any suggestions that I might have a significant role in inheriting Dad's estate. By the time people began to leave, she'd successfully positioned herself as the competent, business-savvy daughter while reducing me to the well-meaning but impractical sister who'd need to be taken care of. "See you tomorrow, Zara," Natasha said as we finally prepared to leave the cemetery. "I hope you're prepared for some big changes." "I hope you are too," I replied quietly. She laughed, clearly assuming I meant I hoped she was prepared for the responsibility of inheriting everything. "Don't worry about me. I've been ready for this for a long time." As I watched her walk away with Cameron, their heads bent together in what looked like planning discussions, I realized that tomorrow's will reading wasn't going to be the formality they expected. Dad had always been full of surprises. Mr. Peterson's law office felt smaller than I remembered, the dark wood paneling and heavy leather furniture creating an atmosphere of old-world formality that matched the gravity of why we were there. I arrived 15 minutes early, needing time to collect myself before facing Natasha and Cameron's confident expectations. They walked in precisely on time, Natasha dressed in a sharp navy business suit that looked like it cost more than I made in a month. Cameron carried a leather briefcase and wore the expression of someone attending a routine business meeting rather than the reading of a family member's will. "Good morning, Zara," Natasha said, settling into the chair beside me with practiced grace. "I hope you slept well. I know this must be difficult for you." The condescending sympathy in her voice made my jaw clench, but I managed a neutral nod. "I'm fine." Mr. Peterson entered a moment later, carrying a thick folder and wearing the serious expression I remembered from childhood visits to his office with Dad. He'd handled all of our family's legal matters for as long as I could remember. Mom's will, Dad's business contracts, even my college paperwork. "Ladies, Cameron," he said, settling behind his mahogany desk. "Thank you for coming. I know this is a difficult time, but we need to address Jonathan's final wishes." Natasha straightened in her chair, her hands folded perfectly in her lap. Cameron pulled out a legal pad, apparently planning to take notes on their windfall. "Before we begin," Mr. Peterson continued, opening the folder, "I want you both to know that your father spent considerable time ensuring his wishes were clearly documented and legally sound. This will was updated just 6 months ago, and every provision reflects his careful consideration. We appreciate Dad's thoroughness," Natasha said smoothly. "He always was meticulous about important matters." Mr. Peterson nodded, then began reading the formal language that opened the document. It covered the usual preliminaries, Dad's full name, his sound mental state when creating the will, the revocation of all previous wills. Standard legal procedures that felt surreal when applied to my father's life. "Now, regarding the distribution of assets," Mr. Peterson said, his voice taking on a more formal tone. "Jonathan's primary assets include his residential property at 1247 Maple Street, his construction business, Crawford and Associates, and various investment properties and financial accounts." Natasha's spine straightened even more if that was possible. Cameron's pen hovered over his legal pad, ready to record the details of their inheritance. "The residential property at 1247 Maple Street, including all furnishings and personal effects, is bequeathed entirely to his daughter Zara Crawford." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. Natasha's confident smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "I'm sorry," she said with a small laugh. "Did you say the house goes to Zara?" "That's correct," Mr. Peterson confirmed, continuing to read. "Additionally, the business Crawford and Associates, including all equipment, contracts, accounts and business properties, is also bequeathed entirely to Zara Crawford. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel Natasha's shock radiating from the chair beside me. Cameron's pen had stopped moving entirely. I don't understand, Natasha said, her voice strained. There must be some mistake. Mr. Peterson looked up from the document. There's no mistake, Natasha. Your father was very specific about these provisions. But what about me? She asked, her composure finally cracking. What did Dad leave me? Mr. Peterson returned to the document. To my daughter Natasha, I leave my collection of first edition books and the sum of $50,000 to be distributed from my savings account. $50,000? Natasha's voice rose. And some old books? That's it. I'm afraid so, Mr. Peterson said gently. However, there's more to discuss regarding Zara's inheritance. More? I couldn't process what I'd already heard. The house, the business, it was more than I'd ever imagined receiving. But Mr. Peterson wasn't finished. Your father also established a trust fund, managed through our firm, which has been growing for the past 12 years. The current value of this trust is approximately $2.8 million, and it transfers entirely to Zara upon Jonathan's death. The number hit me like a physical blow. $2.8 million. Dad had been secretly building a trust fund worth millions while driving his old pickup truck and wearing second-hand work clothes. Natasha shot to her feet. This is ridiculous. There has to be a mistake. Dad wouldn't leave everything to Zara and give me practically nothing. I understand this is surprising, Mr. Peterson said calmly, but your father was very clear about his reasoning. In fact, he left a personal letter explaining his decisions. Would you like me to read it? Yes, I whispered, finding my voice for the first time since the reading began. Absolutely, Natasha snapped. I want to hear what he could possibly say to justify this insult. Mr. Peterson opened a sealed envelope and unfolded a letter written in Dad's familiar handwriting. My dear daughters, he read aloud. If you're hearing this, I'm gone, and I hope you understand that every decision I made was carefully considered and based on love for both of you, though expressed differently. Love? Natasha muttered bitterly. Mr. Peterson continued. Zara, you have spent your life caring for others, never asking for recognition or reward. You chose a profession that helps heal broken spirits, and you've never wavered from that path despite the financial challenges. You visit me weekly, call me daily, and treat everyone you meet with kindness and respect. You are exactly the daughter your mother hoped you'd become. Tears welled in my eyes. Dad had noticed everything I'd tried to do, everything I'd tried to be. Natasha, you are brilliant and ambitious, and I'm proud of your professional success. However, your priorities and mine have never aligned. I know you see my business as an asset to be managed and my house as property to be sold. You've made it clear through your words and actions that you view your inheritance in terms of monetary value rather than family legacy. Natasha's face had gone pale. Cameron reached over to squeeze her hand, but she jerked away from him. I leave everything to Zara because I know she will honor what these things really represent. Not just financial assets, but the life I built with your mother, the work that gave me purpose, the home where we raised our family. Zara understands that some things are more valuable than money. The letter continued with instructions about specific items Dad wanted me to have, including Mom's jewelry and photo albums, and his hopes that I would either continue the business or ensure it went to someone who would maintain its standards and treat the employees fairly. When Mr. Peterson finished reading, the office fell silent again. Natasha stared at the floor, her hands clenched into fists. Cameron looked like he was running calculations in his head, probably trying to figure out if they had any legal grounds to contest the will. This isn't over, Natasha said finally, her voice low and dangerous. Dad was clearly not thinking straight when he wrote this. No rational person leaves a construction business to someone who knows nothing about construction. Actually, Mr. Peterson said mildly, your father anticipated this reaction. The will includes a provision stating that any attempt to contest it will result in the complete forfeiture of the $50,000 inheritance. He wanted to discourage lengthy legal battles that would only benefit the lawyers. Cameron finally spoke. We need to review our options. This is highly irregular. It's irregular, I said quietly, but it's not illegal. Dad had the right to leave his property to whoever he chose. Natasha whirled to face me. You manipulated him. You spent all that time visiting, pretending to care, just so you could get your hands on his money. The accusation hit harder than I expected. That's not true and you know it. Do I? You were always there, always playing the perfect daughter, making the rest of us look bad. Well, congratulations. Your little performance worked. Natasha, Mr. Peterson interrupted firmly. I've known your family for 15 years. Your father's decision was based on his own observations and experiences. No one influenced him. But Natasha was beyond listening. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door, Cameron following behind her with their unused legal pad. This isn't over, Zara, she said, pausing at the door. I'll fight this with everything I have. That business should be mine and everyone knows it. After they left, Mr. Peterson and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. The magnitude of what had just happened was slowly sinking in. I was suddenly wealthy, suddenly a business owner, suddenly responsible for Dad's employees and his legacy. Are you okay? Mr. Peterson asked gently. I think so, I said, though I wasn't sure. I never expected this. Your father hoped you didn't, he replied with a small smile. He wanted it to be a surprise, a security net you'd never have to worry about. He was very proud of you, Zara. He talked about you every time we met. As I left the law office that day, clutching copies of documents that made me a millionaire, I knew Natasha was right about one thing. This wasn't over. 3 days after the will reading, Natasha's campaign to overturn Dad's final wishes began in earnest. It started with a certified letter delivered to my apartment, thick with legal letterhead and formal language that boiled down to a simple message. She was contesting the will. The lawyer she'd hired, a sharp-suited woman named Ms. Bradley, had crafted a document that painted me as a manipulative daughter who'd taken advantage of a grieving widower's emotional vulnerability. According to their filing, I had systematically isolated the deceased from his eldest daughter, and exerted undue influence during a period of diminished mental capacity. I read the accusations twice, hardly believing the words on the page. They were claiming Dad wasn't mentally competent when he'd updated his will 6 months ago. They were suggesting I'd brainwashed him into cutting Natasha out of her rightful inheritance. My phone rang before I'd finished processing the legal document. Did you get the papers? Natasha's voice was cold and businesslike, nothing like the sister I'd grown up with. I got them, I said. I can't believe you're actually doing this. You can't believe I'm fighting for what's rightfully mine? Dad built that business over 30 years. He always intended for me to inherit it. Then why didn't he leave it to you? The question hung in the air for a moment before Natasha's response came, sharp and bitter. Because you manipulated him. You played on his emotions after Mom died, made yourself indispensable, and slowly turned him against me. That's not what happened, and you know it. What I know is that Dad was lonely and grieving, and you took advantage of that. You probably convinced him that I didn't care about him, that I was only interested in his money. The irony was staggering. Natasha was accusing me of exactly what she'd been doing, of viewing Dad's assets in terms of dollar signs rather than family legacy. I never said anything negative about you to Dad, I said. Not once. Maybe not directly, but I'm sure you found subtle ways to undermine me. Little comments here and there, pointing out when I couldn't visit as often because of work commitments. Natasha, listen to yourself. You're creating a conspiracy theory because you can't accept that Dad made his own decision. His decision was based on incomplete information, she snapped. He didn't know about my business plans, my vision for expanding the company. He didn't understand how much more successful I could make it. There was the real issue. Natasha wasn't just angry about losing the inheritance. She was furious that Dad hadn't recognized her ambitions and given her the chance to prove herself as a business leader. Maybe he did understand your plans, I said quietly. Maybe that's exactly why he chose differently. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was ice cold. We'll see what a judge thinks about your understanding of Dad's wishes. Ms. Bradley is very confident about our case. Over the following weeks, Natasha's legal offensive escalated beyond anything I'd imagined possible. She'd hired a private investigator who began interviewing people from Dad's construction sites, asking leading questions about his mental state and whether they'd noticed any changes in his behavior over the past year. The investigator showed up at my workplace, questioning my supervisor about my schedule and whether I'd been taking unusual amounts of time off to visit Dad. He interviewed Mrs. Rodriguez, asking whether she'd observed me spending excessive time at Dad's house and whether Dad had seemed confused or easily influenced in recent months. Most disturbing of all, Natasha began spreading rumors through Dad's church and among his business associates, suggesting that I'd moved back to town specifically to position myself as his primary caregiver and heir. She painted a picture of calculated manipulation that made me sound like a predator who'd targeted her own father. People are talking, Zara, my friend Monica warned me over coffee. I heard Janet from the church ladies group telling people that Natasha thinks you convinced your dad to change his will by making him feel guilty about your struggles as a single woman. That's ridiculous, I said, but my stomach turned at the thought of people I'd known for years questioning my motives. I know it's ridiculous, but some people are buying into it. Especially people who don't know you very well. Natasha's very convincing when she wants to be. She was right. Natasha had always been skilled at presenting herself in the best possible light while subtly undermining anyone who stood in her way. In high school, she'd convinced our parents that I was irresponsible by pointing out every small mistake I made while highlighting her own achievements. She was doing the same thing now, but with much higher stakes. The campaign reached its peak when Cameron arranged for a mental health expert to review Dad's medical records and provide an opinion about his cognitive state during his final months. The expert, Dr. Hoffman, concluded that while Dad showed no signs of dementia or severe mental impairment, grief and isolation following his wife's death may have made him more susceptible to emotional manipulation by family members seeking financial gain. It was a carefully worded assessment that stopped short of declaring Dad incompetent while still supporting Natasha's narrative. The report suggested that a loving but financially struggling daughter could have unconsciously influenced her father's decisions through regular visits and emotional support during his time of grief. When I read Dr. Hoffman's report, I felt sick. They were twisting Dad's love for me into evidence of manipulation. Every conversation we'd had, every meal we'd shared, every time I'd helped him with yard work or listened to him talk about missing Mom, it was all being reframed as part of a scheme to steal Natasha's inheritance. They're not going to win, Mr. Peterson assured me during one of our strategy meetings. Your father's will is ironclad and his reasoning was sound. But they're definitely going to make this process as unpleasant as possible. Why? I asked. Even if they somehow succeeded in overturning the will, the legal fees alone are going to cost them a fortune. Natasha's $50,000 won't even cover half of what this is costing. Mr. Peterson sighed. Sometimes these cases aren't really about money. They're about pride, about validation, about proving a point. Natasha feels rejected by her father's choice, and she's channeling that hurt into anger at you. So what do? We defend the will, we document every false claim they make, and we wait for them to run out of money or energy. Unfortunately, sometimes the only way to stop people from fighting is to let them exhaust themselves. But as the weeks dragged on, it became clear that Natasha and Cameron had no intention of giving up easily. They'd mortgaged their own house to pay legal fees, borrowed money from Cameron's parents, and even started a GoFundMe page claiming they were fighting to preserve family values against a manipulative sister who'd stolen their inheritance. The GoFundMe page was particularly painful to read. It featured a photo of Natasha and Cameron looking somber and determined, with text describing their fight for justice against elder abuse and family manipulation. They'd raised almost $15,000 from people who believed their version of events. I realized that this battle was about more than Dad's will. Natasha was trying to destroy my reputation, my relationships, and my sense of belonging in the community where I'd grown up. She wanted to win so completely that I'd be forced to leave town in shame. What she didn't know was that Dad's trust fund included more than just money. It included evidence. The deeper Natasha's legal team dug into Dad's affairs, the more uncomfortable truths began to surface. Truths that had nothing to do with my relationship with Dad and everything to do with Natasha's own actions over the years. It started when Ms. Bradley subpoenaed Dad's business financial records, hoping to find evidence that I'd influenced his business decisions or gained access to company accounts. What they found instead were discrepancies that dated back 3 years, small but consistent irregularities in petty cash accounts and supply orders that someone had been very careful to hide. Mr. Peterson called me on a Tuesday morning with news that made my coffee go cold. Zara, we need to talk. The investigation your sister demanded has uncovered some interesting information about the business finances. An hour later, I sat in his office staring at spreadsheets and bank statements that told a story I never could have imagined. Dad's bookkeeper, Mrs. Foster, had flagged the irregularities months before Dad's death, but she'd been afraid to confront him directly about them. The pattern is subtle but consistent, Mr. Peterson explained, pointing to highlighted entries on the financial reports. Someone with access to company purchasing accounts was ordering supplies that never made it to job sites. The invoices were legitimate, the payments went through, but the materials disappeared. How much are we talking about? Over 3 years? Approximately $47,000 worth of equipment and materials. My stomach dropped. You think Natasha was stealing from Dad's company? The evidence suggests someone was. The question is who had access to the purchasing system and delivery schedules. That question was answered the next day when Mrs. Foster finally agreed to give a formal statement. She'd been terrified of making accusations without proof, but with lawyers involved and subpoenas flying, she couldn't stay silent any longer. Natasha had me add her as an authorized user on the purchasing account 2 years ago, Mrs. Foster explained, her hands shaking as she spoke. She said your father wanted her to help streamline the ordering process, make it more efficient. She had all the right authorization codes and seemed to know exactly what she was doing. The timeline made horrible sense. 2 years ago was when Natasha had started making more frequent visits to Dad's office, claiming she wanted to understand the family business better. Dad had been proud of her interest, pleased that she was finally showing enthusiasm for his life's work. Did you ever question the orders she was placing? Mr. Peterson asked gently. Mrs. Foster nodded miserably. A few times. When expensive power tools were delivered to addresses I didn't recognize, or when bulk materials never showed up at the job sites they were supposed to be for. But Natasha always had explanations: emergency repairs at remote locations, materials being stored at Cameron's law office for upcoming projects, special orders for clients who wanted specific brands. Did you tell my father about your concerns? I tried to once. But Natasha was there that day and she explained everything so smoothly. Made it sound like I was confused about the new system she was implementing. Your father trusted her completely and I needed this job. I'm 63 years old. I couldn't risk being seen as a troublemaker. The full scope of Natasha's scheme became clear when Cameron's involvement was revealed. Several of the suspicious delivery addresses belonged to properties Cameron was flipping on the side. Houses he'd buy, renovate with materials stolen from Dad's company, and then sell for profit. The stolen equipment had been sold through online marketplaces, with the proceeds going into accounts that Natasha and Cameron controlled jointly. They were running a systematic theft operation using Dad's business as their supply source, I said, staring at the evidence spread across Mr. Peterson's desk. And they did it while pretending to care about the family company. It gets worse, Mr. Peterson said grimly. The private investigator they hired has been asking questions about your father's mental state, but some of the people he interviewed remember Natasha making comments about your father's declining judgment and his tendency to trust the wrong people. She's been laying groundwork for this mental incompetency claim for months. The betrayal was breathtaking in its scope and calculation. Natasha hadn't just been stealing from Dad, she'd been setting up a narrative that would let her steal everything while painting herself as the victim of an incompetent father and a manipulative sister. When confronted with the evidence, Ms. Bradley tried to spin the situation in Natasha's favor. My client was attempting to modernize an outdated business system, she argued during an emergency meeting. Any irregularities in the financial records reflect the growing pains of implementing new procedures, not intentional theft. Then why, Mr. Peterson asked calmly, were the materials delivered to addresses unrelated to any Crawford and Associates projects? And why were expensive tools being sold through Cameron's personal eBay account? Ms. Bradley had no answer for that. The situation deteriorated further when Dad's business insurance company launched their own investigation. The missing materials had been covered under the company's theft insurance, and Dad had filed several claims over the past 2 years, believing his equipment was being stolen from job sites by outside thieves. Your father was paying higher insurance premiums because of the theft claims, the insurance investigator explained. He even installed additional security measures at his warehouse and job sites, trying to prevent what he thought was external theft. He never suspected the thefts were coming from inside his own family. I felt sick imagining Dad worrying about thieves, spending money on security systems and filing police reports, while the real thieves sat at his dinner table and called him Dad. The final blow to Natasha's case came when the private investigator she'd hired made a crucial mistake. In his eagerness to find evidence against me, he'd interviewed Jake Morrison, one of Dad's longtime employees who'd worked closely with both Dad and Natasha over the years. Jake's statement was devastating. Mr. Crawford was sharp as a tack right up until he died. Never showed any signs of confusion or forgetfulness. But I did notice that Natasha seemed to know an awful lot about our inventory and delivery schedules for someone who supposedly wasn't involved in day-to-day operations. She'd show up at job sites asking specific questions about what materials we still needed, what tools were going unused. At the time, I thought she was just being thorough, trying to help her dad run things more efficiently. Jake also remembered Natasha making comments about how wasteful Dad was with his money, how he didn't understand modern business practices, and how the company could be so much more profitable with better management. She talked about your father like he was this old-fashioned guy who didn't know what he was doing, Jake told the investigator. But Mr. Crawford built that business from nothing and kept it successful for 30 years. He knew exactly what he was doing until the day he died. When Jake's statement was entered into evidence, along with the financial records showing the systematic theft, Natasha's legal strategy collapsed completely. Not only could she not prove that Dad was mentally incompetent, but she'd inadvertently provided evidence of her own criminal behavior. Ms. Bradley withdrew from the case within a week, claiming irreconcilable differences with her client's approach to the litigation. Translation: she didn't want her name associated with what was clearly going to become a criminal matter. Cameron tried to distance himself from the theft scheme, claiming he'd been unaware that the materials Natasha brought to his renovation projects were stolen. But bank records showed that he'd been depositing proceeds from equipment sales into accounts he controlled, and several witnesses confirmed that he'd been present when delivery trucks dropped off Crawford and Associates materials at his flip properties. "We're looking at felony theft charges," Mr. Peterson explained during one of our meetings. $47,000 puts this well above the misdemeanor threshold. The district attorney's office is very interested in prosecuting this case, especially given the family relationship and the attempted cover-up through the will contest. I should have felt vindicated. The investigation Natasha demanded had proven not only that Dad was mentally competent when he wrote his will, but that Natasha herself was a thief who'd been systematically stealing from the man she claimed to love and respect. Instead, I felt hollow. This was my sister, the person who'd taught me to braid my hair and helped me with my homework. The same person who'd stood beside me at Mom's funeral and promised we'd always have each other. Now she was facing prison time for stealing from our father. What happens next? I asked Mr. Peterson. The will contest dies with the collapse of their legal case. The criminal charges proceed independently. And you, he said, looking at me with something like sympathy, you get to decide whether you want to press civil charges for the return of the stolen money. I stared out the window of his office, watching people walk by on the sidewalk below. Normal people with normal family problems, not sisters who discovered that their siblings were criminals. I need time to think about it, I said. But even as I said the words, I knew what Dad would have wanted me to do. Justice didn't always feel good, but that didn't make it any less necessary. With Natasha's legal challenge crumbling and criminal charges looming, I finally had the space to examine exactly what Dad had left me. What I discovered made me realize that I'd known only a fraction of the man my father really was. Mr. Peterson had scheduled a full asset review meeting, and I arrived at his office expecting to discuss the house, the construction company, and the trust fund. What I found instead were 3 additional folders filled with property deeds, investment statements, and business partnerships I'd never heard Dad mention. Your father was remarkably private about the full extent of his holdings, Mr. Peterson began, spreading documents across his conference table. Even I only learned about some of these assets when we conducted the comprehensive estate inventory. The first folder contained property deeds for rental houses in 3 different states. Not just 1 or 2 properties, but an entire portfolio of residential real estate that Dad had been quietly acquiring and managing for over 15 years. 12 properties total, Mr. Peterson explained. 6 here in state, 3 in Georgia, and 3 in North Carolina. All fully rented, all generating steady monthly income. The combined rental income is approximately $18,000 per month. $18,000 per month. More than $200,000 per year in rental income alone, and I'd had no idea any of it existed. How did he manage all this without me knowing? I asked, overwhelmed by the scope of what I was learning. He hired a property management company to handle the day-to-day operations. Tenants, repairs, rent collection. Everything was handled professionally, so he didn't have to travel or spend time on management tasks. The income was automatically deposited into a separate business account. The second folder revealed something even more surprising. Dad had been a silent partner in 4 other construction companies across the region. Not a passive investor, but an active business partner who provided capital, expertise, and mentorship to younger contractors who were starting their own firms. Your father helped launch these companies by providing startup capital and sharing his industry knowledge, Mr. Peterson continued. In return, he receives 20% of their annual profits. Last year alone, his partnership income was over $400,000. $400,000. I was beginning to understand why the trust fund had grown so large. Dad hadn't just been successful, he'd been wealthy in ways that went far beyond anything I'd imagined. But why didn't he ever talk about any of this? I asked. He lived so modestly. He drove that old truck, shopped at thrift stores, never took expensive vacations. Mr. Peterson smiled sadly. Your father told me once that he'd seen too many families destroyed by money. He wanted to build security for his children without letting wealth change how he lived or how his family related to each other. The third folder contained the most shocking revelation of all. Dad had been quietly funding scholarship programs at 3 local colleges, providing full tuition assistance for students pursuing careers in skilled trades. Over the past 10 years, he'd paid for more than 60 students to get training in construction, electrical work, plumbing, and other technical fields. The scholarship program was completely anonymous, Mr. Peterson explained. Recipients never knew their benefactor was Jonathan Crawford. He just wanted to help young people get the training they needed to build good careers. I sat back in my chair trying to process the magnitude of what I was learning. Dad hadn't just been a successful contractor. He'd been a quiet philanthropist, a business mentor, and a real estate investor whose empire spanned multiple states. What's the total value of everything? I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Mr. Peterson consulted his calculator and several spreadsheets. The house is worth approximately $400,000. The construction business, including equipment and contracts, is valued at roughly $800,000. The rental properties total about $1.9 million in current market value. The partnership interests are harder to value precisely, but conservatively worth at least $1.2 million. Add in the $2.8 million trust fund and various other accounts, and you're looking at total inherited assets worth approximately $7.1 million. $7 million. I was a millionaire 7 times over, and I'd spent the past month worrying about whether I could afford to keep Dad's house. There's one more thing, Mr. Peterson said, opening a final envelope. Your father left specific instructions about what he hoped you'd do with this inheritance. He handed me a letter written in Dad's careful handwriting, different from the one that had been read at the will hearing. This one was longer, more detailed, and clearly written with the assumption that I'd be learning about the full scope of his empire. My dear Zara, the letter began, if you're reading this, then you now know that your old man was better at keeping secrets than you probably thought possible. I hope you're not too shocked by everything you've discovered. The letter went on to explain Dad's philosophy about wealth and responsibility. He'd built his empire not for luxury or status, but to create security and opportunities for others. The rental properties provided affordable housing in communities where decent rentals were scarce. The business partnerships helped talented contractors build their own companies. The scholarships gave young people chances they might not otherwise have. I'm leaving everything to you because I know you understand that money is a tool, not a goal, Dad had written. You've spent your career helping people heal and grow, usually for far less money than you deserve. Now you have the resources to help on a much larger scale if that's what you choose to do. The letter included detailed suggestions about how I might use the inheritance. I could expand the scholarship program, establish a foundation for helping families in crisis, or use the resources to support the kind of community healing work I'd been doing on a small scale for years. But more than anything, Dad concluded, I want you to know that this inheritance comes with no strings attached. If you want to sell everything and travel the world, that's fine. If you want to give it all away, that's fine too. It's yours now, to use however brings you the most peace and purpose. As I finished reading the letter, I realized that Dad's decision to leave everything to me hadn't been about favoring one daughter over the other. It had been about recognizing which daughter shared his values about what money should be used for. Natasha had seen the construction business as an asset to be maximized for profit. She'd viewed the house as property to be sold for cash. She'd never asked about Dad's other interests or shown any curiosity about his charitable activities. I, on the other hand, had spent my career choosing purpose over profit, helping people heal rather than building personal wealth. Dad had trusted that I'd use his empire the same way he had, not to make myself rich, but to make other people's lives better. What do you think? Mr. Peterson asked after giving me time to absorb everything. It's a lot to process. It is, I agreed. But I think I'm starting to understand what Dad really wanted me to inherit. What's that? Not just money, I said, looking at the documents spread across the table. Responsibility. The chance to continue what he started, but in my own way. For the first time since Dad's death, I felt ready to embrace the future he'd planned for me. A future where I could help people on a scale I'd never imagined possible. But first, I had to finish dealing with the mess Natasha had created. The annual Crawford family reunion had been planned before Dad's death, back when we'd all assumed it would be a normal gathering of cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends. Now it felt more like walking into a courtroom where half the jury had already decided I was guilty of manipulating my way into an inheritance I didn't deserve. Natasha had been working the family network hard over the past 2 months, sharing her version of events with anyone who would listen. By the time I arrived at Cousin Patricia's house for the reunion, the battle lines were clearly drawn. "Zara, honey," Aunt Ruth greeted me with a hug that felt stiff and uncomfortable. "How are you holding up with all this legal unpleasantness?" "I'm managing," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. "It's such a shame when family money causes problems," she continued, her tone suggesting she believed those problems were somehow my fault. "Your father would be so upset to see his daughters fighting." Before I could respond, Natasha's voice carried across the backyard. She was holding court near the picnic tables, surrounded by several relatives who were hanging on her every word. "The whole situation is just heartbreaking," she was saying, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I know Dad wasn't thinking clearly after Mom died. Grief does terrible things to people's judgment." Uncle Frank, Dad's brother, nodded sympathetically. "Jonathan was never the same after we lost Margaret. Maybe he was more vulnerable than we realized." "That's exactly what I keep trying to tell people," Natasha continued. "Dad needed support and guidance, not someone taking advantage of his emotional state." I felt my face burn as several relatives glanced in my direction. Natasha was doing it again, painting herself as the victim and me as the predator, all while accepting sympathy from people who didn't know the full story. Cameron appeared beside his wife, carrying 2 plates of food and wearing his most sincere expression. "The hardest part is knowing that Jonathan wanted both his daughters to be taken care of. This was never supposed to turn into a battle. But surely there's some way to work things out?" asked Cousin Diana. "Some kind of compromise that would honor Jonathan's wishes while being fair to both girls?" "We've tried," Cameron said with a heavy sigh. "We've offered to settle this quietly, to split the inheritance more equitably. But some people would rather have everything than share anything." The implication was clear. I was the greedy sister who refused to compromise, who wanted to keep all of Dad's wealth for myself while leaving Natasha with nothing. I'd planned to stay quiet, to avoid a confrontation that would just give people more reason to take sides. But listening to them twist the truth while playing the role of grieving victims was more than I could stand. "Actually," I said, stepping closer to their group, "I think people should know the real reason there's no compromise." Natasha's eyes flashed with alarm, but she quickly composed herself. "Zara, please. This isn't the time or place for family drama." "You're right," I agreed. "Family reunions are for celebrating family bonds and honoring the people we've lost. That's why I think everyone should know what Dad's investigation revealed about how his business was really being run." A hush fell over the group. Cameron shifted uncomfortably, his lawyer instincts clearly telling him to shut down this conversation before it went too far. "I don't know what you're implying," Natasha said carefully, "but if you're going to make accusations, you should be very careful about what you say." "I'm not making accusations," I replied calmly. "I'm stating facts that are already part of the legal record." I pulled out a folder I'd brought with me, copies of the financial documents that had been entered as evidence in the criminal case. These are bank records showing systematic theft from Dad's construction company over a 3-year period. $47,000 worth of equipment and materials ordered through company accounts and diverted to unauthorized locations. Uncle Frank frowned, clearly confused. "What does this have to do with the will?" "The theft was committed by someone with authorized access to the company purchasing system," I continued. "Someone Dad trusted completely. Someone who used that trust to steal from him while he was still alive, then tried to claim he wasn't mentally competent when he chose not to leave her his business." Natasha's face had gone pale, but she tried to maintain her composure. "These are wild allegations being made by lawyers who are desperate to justify an unjust will." "Actually," I said, opening the folder and showing them the highlighted bank statements, "these are charges filed by the district attorney's office. Criminal charges for felony theft." The silence stretched uncomfortably as family members processed what I was telling them. Several people looked from the documents to Natasha's face, clearly trying to understand what they were hearing. That has to be some kind of mistake," Aunt Ruth said weakly. "It's not a mistake," I replied. "Mrs. Foster, Dad's bookkeeper, has given a detailed statement about how the theft operation worked. Dad's business insurance company has confirmed that materials covered by theft claims were actually stolen by authorized company personnel. The private investigator Natasha hired has documented statements from Dad's employees about how unusual her knowledge of inventory and delivery schedules was for someone not involved in daily operations. Cameron finally found his voice. These are unproven allegations. No one has been convicted of anything. You're right, I said. But the evidence is pretty overwhelming. Delivery records showing Crawford and Associates materials being sent to your house renovation projects. Bank deposits from equipment sales going into accounts you control. Employees who remember you both being very interested in what tools and materials weren't being used on active job sites. Uncle Frank was studying the documents I'd shown him, his expression growing darker as he recognized the scope of what had been happening. Natasha, please tell me this isn't true. It's all been taken out of context, Natasha said desperately. I was trying to help Dad modernize his business practices. If there were any irregularities, they were honest mistakes, not intentional theft. Honest mistakes don't get delivered to your husband's construction projects, I said quietly. And they don't get sold through his personal eBay account. The family reunion had turned into a public trial, with evidence being presented and judgments being formed in real time. I could see the shift happening as relatives processed the information and began to understand that the sweet, victimized sister they'd been sympathizing with was actually a criminal who'd been stealing from their beloved Uncle Jonathan. So let me get this straight, Patricia said slowly. You're saying that Natasha was stealing from Dad's business, and then when Dad left everything to Zara, Natasha claimed he wasn't mentally competent? That's exactly what I'm saying, I confirmed. And the investigation she demanded to prove Dad's incompetence is what uncovered the evidence of the theft. Diana shook her head in disgust. So you were stealing from your own father, and then you had the nerve to claim that Zara manipulated him? Natasha's careful composure finally cracked. You don't understand how hard it was to watch Dad make mistake after mistake with that business. He was wasting money, missing opportunities, running things like it was still 1990. I was trying to save the company from his outdated management. By stealing from him? Uncle Frank's voice was cold with anger. By taking equipment and selling it for your own profit? It wasn't like that, Natasha protested. The money was going toward improving efficiency, investing in better systems. Everything I did was meant to help the business grow. Into your bank account, I said. $47,000 worth of help that somehow never made it back to Dad's company. The reunion broke up shortly after that, with most of the family making polite excuses to leave early. But before they left, several relatives made a point of telling me they were sorry for believing Natasha's version of events and that they now understood why Dad had made the choices he did. Your father was a smart man, Uncle Frank said, giving me a fierce hug. He saw through her lies even when the rest of us didn't. I'm glad he made sure his life's work went to someone who would honor it. As I watched Natasha and Cameron leave without saying goodbye to anyone, I felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. The truth was finally out, but it had cost me any remaining relationship with my sister. Still, I knew Dad would have been proud of me for standing up to the lies and making sure our family knew who he really was and what he'd really stood for. Justice wasn't always comfortable, but it was always worth it. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everything look pale and institutional. Natasha and Cameron sat at the defendant's table with their new lawyer, a tired-looking public defender who'd been assigned after their expensive private attorney had dropped the case when the evidence became overwhelming. I was there as a witness, not a plaintiff. The criminal charges had been filed by the state after the district attorney reviewed the evidence uncovered during the will contest. But as Dad's heir and the victim of the theft by extension, my testimony was crucial to establishing the full scope of what had happened. Miss Crawford, the prosecutor began, can you tell the court about your relationship with your father's business prior to his death? I wasn't involved in the day-to-day operations, I testified. Dad occasionally asked for my opinion about employees or customer service issues, but I had no access to financial accounts or business decisions. I knew very little about the company's actual revenues or operations. Did your father ever discuss concerns about missing equipment or materials from the business? Yes, I said, remembering those conversations with painful clarity. He mentioned several times over the past 2 years that tools and materials were disappearing from job sites. He installed security cameras and filed insurance claims because he thought outside thieves were targeting his company. The prosecutor walked me through the timeline of Dad's will updates, his mental state during our regular conversations, and my complete lack of knowledge about his wealth until after his death. The goal was to establish that not only had I not manipulated Dad into changing his will, but I'd had no idea there was anything worth manipulating him for. Miss Crawford, had you known about your father's extensive property investments and business partnerships, would that have changed your career choices or financial planning? Probably, I admitted. If I'd known Dad was wealthy, I might have asked for help with my student loans or saving for a house. But he never mentioned any of it. He wanted me to make my own way in the world. The defense attorney, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, tried to establish that Dad's secrecy about his wealth was evidence of mental decline or paranoia. But his cross-examination backfired when I described the detailed conversations Dad and I had about current events, books we were reading, and complex family dynamics right up until his death. Your father discussed philosophy and literature with you regularly? The defense attorney asked. Yes. He was reading Marcus Aurelius when he died. We'd been debating different interpretations of Stoic philosophy for weeks before his death. And he managed complex business relationships and investments during this same period? Apparently so, though I didn't know about most of them at the time. The prosecutor called Mrs. Foster next, and her testimony was devastating to Natasha's case. The elderly bookkeeper described in detail how Natasha had gained access to company accounts, how she'd placed unauthorized orders, and how she'd always had plausible explanations that made questioning her decisions seem disloyal or confused. Did you ever suspect that Mrs. Cameron was stealing from the company? The prosecutor asked. Mrs. Foster nodded sadly. Toward the end, yes. But she was the boss's daughter, and she always made me feel foolish for questioning her decisions. I thought maybe I was the one who didn't understand the new systems she was implementing. Jake Morrison, the longtime employee who'd worked closely with Dad, testified about Natasha's unusual knowledge of inventory and her critical comments about Dad's management style. His testimony painted a picture of someone who felt entitled to make decisions about a business she didn't own and had never actually helped build. But the most damaging testimony came from Cameron himself. Under pressure from the prosecutor and facing potential perjury charges if he lied, he admitted to receiving stolen materials and equipment from Natasha, selling items through online marketplaces, and using Crawford and Associates supplies for his personal construction projects. Did you know the materials your wife was providing were stolen from her father's business? The prosecutor asked. Cameron's answer was careful but incriminating. I knew the materials came from Crawford and Associates. I assumed Natasha had her father's permission to redirect and use supplies. Did you ever ask Mr. Crawford directly for permission to use his company's materials for your personal projects? No. Did you ever pay Crawford and Associates for the materials you used? No. Did you report the income from selling Crawford and Associates equipment on your tax returns? Cameron's pause before answering told everyone in the courtroom exactly what his response would be. No. The evidence was overwhelming: bank records, delivery receipts, insurance claims, witness statements, and digital records from online sales platforms. Natasha and Cameron had been caught in a web of documentation that made denial impossible. When Natasha took the stand in her own defense, her testimony was a disaster. She tried to maintain that she'd been helping improve Dad's business operations, but under cross-examination she couldn't explain why improvements required stealing equipment and materials for personal use. Mrs. Cameron, you testified that you were trying to modernize your father's business practices. Can you explain how selling his tools through your husband's eBay account modernized those practices? The tools weren't being used efficiently. They were just sitting in storage. So you decided to sell them and keep the money rather than return them to your father's company? It wasn't like that. The money was being reinvested. Reinvested where? Can you show the court any evidence that proceeds from these sales were returned to Crawford and Associates? Natasha couldn't answer because no such evidence existed. Every dollar from the theft had gone into accounts she and Cameron controlled, and none of it had ever found its way back to Dad's business. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: felony theft, conspiracy, and tax evasion. The judge, clearly disgusted by the betrayal of family trust involved in the case, sentenced Natasha to 3 years in prison and Cameron to 2 years, plus full restitution of the stolen money with interest. This case represents a particularly troubling breach of family trust, the judge said during sentencing. The defendants systematically stole from a man who loved and trusted them, then attempted to cover their crimes by claiming their victim was mentally incompetent. The cruelty and calculation involved in this scheme demands significant consequences. But the criminal conviction was only part of the victory. The civil restitution order meant that Natasha and Cameron owed the estate $63,000, the original $47,000 plus interest and penalties. Since they'd spent most of their savings on legal fees and had mortgaged their house to pay for the failed will contest, they were facing bankruptcy on top of prison time. Their GoFundMe page, which had raised $15,000 from people who believed their lies about being victims of family manipulation, had been frozen by court order pending investigation into fraud charges related to their fundraising claims. Outside the courthouse, I was approached by several reporters who'd covered the case as an example of family greed and inheritance disputes. But I declined to give interviews or make statements. The court records spoke for themselves, and I had no interest in prolonging the public spectacle. Mr. Peterson walked with me to my car, carrying a briefcase full of legal documents that officially closed this chapter of my life. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Tired," I said honestly. "Relieved but mostly tired. I never wanted any of this to happen." "Your father would be proud of how you handled yourself," he said. "You stood up for the truth even when it was painful. That takes courage." As I drove home to the house that was now officially mine, free from any legal challenges, I thought about Dad and what he would have made of everything that had happened. He'd built a business empire through honesty and hard work, then watched his eldest daughter steal from him while claiming to care about his legacy. But he'd also been wise enough to see the truth about both his daughters before he died. He'd known exactly who deserved to inherit his life's work, and he'd been right. The legal victory was complete, but the real work of honoring Dad's memory was just beginning. 6 months after Natasha's conviction, I stood in the conference room of what had been Dad's construction company, looking at quarterly reports that showed the business was thriving under new management. The stolen equipment had been replaced, the security systems had been upgraded, and employee morale was higher than it had been in years. "Revenue is up 18% from this time last year," reported Jenny Martinez, the new operations manager I'd hired to handle day-to-day business affairs. "The scholarship program announcement has generated a lot of positive publicity, and we're getting bid requests from organizations that want to work with companies that give back to the community." I'd used part of Dad's trust fund to expand his anonymous scholarship program, but I'd made one significant change. The Crawford Foundation scholarships were no longer anonymous. Young people deserved to know that their educations were being funded by a man who believed in the dignity of skilled work and the importance of helping others succeed. "How many scholarship recipients are we funding this year?" I asked. 27 students across 6 different trade programs, Jenny replied. "Everything from electrical work to sustainable building techniques. The technical college says it's the largest single scholarship program they've ever administered." The business side of the inheritance was only part of what I'd been building. The rental property portfolio Dad left me had become the foundation for a low-income housing initiative that provided affordable, well-maintained homes for families who were struggling to find decent places to live. Rather than maximizing rental income, I'd focused on providing stable housing at rates working families could actually afford. The properties were breaking even financially, but the social impact was immeasurable: kids who could attend the same school for multiple years, parents who could save money instead of spending it all on housing, communities that were stabilized by residents who could actually afford to stay. The Martinez family in the Georgia property just sent another thank you note, my property manager had reported during our monthly meeting. Their daughter made honor roll again, and they credit the stability of having affordable housing with giving her the consistency she needed to succeed academically. Those thank you notes meant more to me than all the financial statements and profit reports combined. Dad had built his wealth to create opportunities for others, and I was discovering that continuing his mission brought me more satisfaction than I'd ever found in traditional therapy work. Not that I'd abandoned helping people heal, I just found a way to do it on a much larger scale. The Crawford Foundation had expanded beyond scholarships to fund counseling services for families in crisis, job training programs for people re-entering society after incarceration, and support groups for children who'd lost parents. All the work I'd been doing one person at a time, but now with resources that let me help hundreds of people simultaneously. "The grief counseling program is at capacity again," reported Dr. Sarah Kim, the clinical director I'd hired to run the foundation's mental health initiatives. "We have a waiting list of 43 families who need services." "Then we expand," I said without hesitation. "Add another counselor, rent more office space, whatever it takes." Dad left me these resources to use them for helping people. The success wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. For the first time in my adult life, I woke up each morning excited about the work I was doing. I had the resources to say yes to almost every opportunity to make someone's life better, and the freedom to pursue projects that mattered to me regardless of their profitability. Meanwhile, Natasha and Cameron were discovering that actions have consequences that extend far beyond courtrooms and prison sentences. Cameron had been disbarred after his conviction, ending his legal career permanently. Their house had been foreclosed when they couldn't make payments while paying restitution and legal fees. Natasha's marketing job had fired her immediately after the conviction became public, and her professional reputation was destroyed beyond repair. The most satisfying part, though, was watching their attempts to rebuild their lives after their release from prison. Cameron was working at a hardware store, earning minimum wage and struggling to find anyone willing to hire a convicted felon and disbarred attorney. Natasha had taken a job at a call center, a far cry from the business leadership role she'd always believed she deserved. Their financial situation was dire. The restitution payments took most of their combined income, leaving them barely enough to rent a small apartment in the worst part of town. The designer clothes and luxury lifestyle they'd enjoyed while stealing from Dad were now impossible dreams. I knew all this not because I was monitoring them, but because word travels in small towns, and people who'd been at the family reunion were eager to share updates about how the thieves were faring. I saw Natasha at the grocery store yesterday, Aunt Ruth had told me during one of her visits. She looked tired, older. I almost felt sorry for her until I remembered what she did to your father. I didn't take pleasure in their suffering exactly, but I did find a certain justice in watching them experience the kind of financial stress they tried to inflict on others through their schemes. They were learning what it felt like to worry about money, to have their opportunities limited by their own poor choices, to face the consequences of treating others as stepping stones to personal gain. The real victory, though, wasn't in their downfall, it was in what I was building with the resources Dad had entrusted to me. "We've got another success story," Jenny reported during one of our weekly meetings. "Marcus Thompson, one of our scholarship recipients from 2 years ago, just got hired as a junior partner at Henderson Construction. He's the first in his family to ever have a career instead of just a job. Marcus had grown up in the same low-income housing I was now providing for other families. His mother had worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed, but there'd never been money for college or trade school. The Crawford Foundation scholarship had paid for his electrical training, and now he was earning more than his mother had ever dreamed possible. He wants to fund a scholarship himself next year," Jenny continued. "Says he wants to help another kid the way we helped him." That was the multiplier effect Dad had understood when he built his quiet empire. Money used wisely doesn't just help one person. It creates ripples of opportunity that spread through families and communities for generations. I'd also discovered that running a successful business empire was more rewarding than I'd expected. Under Jenny's management and with the ethical foundation Dad had established, Crawford & Associates was growing rapidly. We'd hired 12 new employees, expanded into 2 additional markets, and developed a reputation as the construction company that treated workers fairly and delivered exactly what it promised. "We're getting more contract requests than we can handle," Jenny reported. "Companies want to work with us because they know our reputation is solid." The scholarship program has become a marketing advantage. People like doing business with companies that invest in their communities. The business partnerships Dad had established were also thriving. The 4 companies he'd helped launch were all successful now, and their partnership payments were providing steady income that I could redirect toward foundation programs. It was a perfect cycle. Dad's business success funding opportunities for others to build their own success. But perhaps the most meaningful part of my new life was the letters I received from people who'd been helped by the various programs I'd established. Parents whose children had received scholarships, families whose lives had been stabilized by affordable housing, people who'd found healing through our counseling services. One letter particularly moved me. "Dear Miss Crawford, my daughter Emma was one of your scholarship recipients last year. She's now in her 2nd year of the plumbing program at Metro Technical College, and she's already been offered a job when she graduates. You probably don't understand what this means to our family. Emma is going to be the first person in 3 generations to have a career that can support a family. She's going to break the cycle of poverty that has trapped us for so long. Thank you for seeing potential in a kid from the wrong side of town and giving her a chance to prove herself." These letters reminded me every day why Dad had chosen to leave his empire to me rather than to Natasha. It wasn't about who was more capable of managing money, it was about who would use that money to honor the values he'd lived by. The Foundation's annual report showed the scope of what we'd accomplished in just 1 year. 47 students receiving full scholarships, 23 families housed in affordable rental properties, 156 people served through our mental health programs, and 89 individuals who'd completed job training programs and found stable employment. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real measure of success was in the transformed lives, the families that were stronger, the communities that were more stable, and the young people who now had opportunities their parents had never dreamed of. As I reviewed the annual report in Dad's old office, now my office, I could almost feel his approval. This was what he'd wanted his life's work to become. Not a monument to his own success, but a foundation for other people's opportunities. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Jenny's voice came through the intercom. "There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." I looked up to see a familiar figure in my doorway, Natasha, looking older and more worn than I'd ever seen her. Gone were the designer clothes and perfect makeup. She wore a simple dress that had seen better days, and her face showed the stress of the past year. "Hello, Zara," she said quietly. "I was wondering if we could talk." Natasha stood in my office doorway looking nothing like the confident, polished woman who'd celebrated her expected inheritance in Dad's living room just over a year ago. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her clothes were clean but obviously inexpensive, and there was a weariness in her eyes that spoke of hard lessons learned too late. "Come in," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "Close the door behind you." She sat down carefully, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For several moments neither of us spoke. The silence stretched uncomfortably as I waited for her to explain why she'd come. "I know you probably don't want to see me," she finally said, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "But I needed to talk to you before I leave town." "You're leaving?" "Cameron found work in Atlanta. Construction company that's willing to hire someone with his background. Fresh start, you know?" She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We can't afford to stay here anyway. The restitution payments, the rent, everything costs more than we make." I nodded but didn't respond. I wasn't going to make this easier for her by pretending to feel sorry about their financial struggles. "I came to ask you for help," Natasha said, the words coming out in a rush as if she'd been practicing them. "Not money," she added quickly when she saw my expression. "I know better than that. But maybe you could write a letter of recommendation? Help me find work somewhere? I've been turned down for every decent job I've applied for because of the conviction." The request was so absurd that I almost laughed. "You want me to recommend you for employment? After you stole from our father and tried to destroy my reputation?" "I know how it sounds," Natasha said desperately. "But I'm trying to rebuild my life. I've learned from my mistakes. I'm not the same person who did those things." "Aren't you?" I asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, you look like the same person who thought she deserved Dad's business because she was more successful than her sister. The same person who called me manipulative while she was literally stealing from our father." Natasha's composure cracked slightly. "I was angry, okay? I felt like Dad never appreciated me, never saw my potential. You were always his favorite, always the one he talked about with pride. That's not true and you know it." "It is true," she snapped, some of her old fire returning. "You with your noble career helping troubled kids, your weekly visits, your deep conversations about philosophy. Dad thought you walked on water while I was just the shallow daughter who cared about money. So you decided to prove him right by stealing his money?" The words hit their mark. Natasha flinched as if I'd slapped her. "I didn't mean for it to go as far as it did," she said quietly. "It started small. A few tools that weren't being used, some materials that were just sitting in storage. Cameron said it was practically borrowing from the family business. $47,000 worth of borrowing? It got out of hand. Every time we took something, it got easier to justify taking more. And we kept telling ourselves we'd pay it back once Cameron's business took off, once I got promoted, once we had more money coming in." I studied my sister's face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus self-pity. What I saw was someone who still didn't fully understand the magnitude of what she'd done. "Do you know what the worst part was?" I asked. "Not the theft, not the will contest, not even the lies you told about me. The worst part was watching Dad worry about security systems and filing police reports because he thought strangers were stealing from him. He died thinking his business was being targeted by criminals, never knowing the criminals were sitting at his dinner table." Natasha started crying then, not the calculated tears she'd produced for family gatherings, but genuine sobs that shook her whole body. I know I hurt him. I hurt all of us. And now I've lost everything that mattered." "You lost everything that mattered to you," I corrected. "Money, status, the respect of people who didn't really know you. But you never cared about what mattered to Dad." "What do you mean?" I gestured around the office, to the walls now covered with photos of scholarship recipients, thank you letters from families we'd helped, and certificates from community organizations recognizing the foundation's work. This is what mattered to Dad. Using success to help other people succeed. building something that would last beyond his own life, creating opportunities for people who needed them. You never understood any of that. Natasha looked at the photos and letters covering the walls, and for the first time, I saw something like understanding in her eyes. The scholarships, she said slowly. The foundation work. You're using Dad's money to help people. I'm continuing what Dad started, I replied. He'd been quietly funding scholarships and helping young contractors start their businesses for years. He just never talked about it because he didn't need recognition for doing the right thing. I never knew, Natasha whispered. You never asked. You were so focused on what Dad could give you that you never wondered what he was already giving to others. We sat in silence for several minutes while Natasha absorbed this revelation. When she finally spoke again, her voice was different, smaller, more broken. I really am sorry, Zara. Not just for the stealing but for everything. For trying to make you look bad, for the lies, for putting our family through all that pain. I was so angry about the will that I couldn't see straight. I believe you're sorry, I said. But being sorry doesn't undo the damage. Dad's gone, our family relationships are destroyed, and you're facing years of consequences for choices you made as an adult. I know. I hoped maybe you could find it in your heart to forgive me. Not forget but forgive. Give me a chance to prove I can be better. The request hung in the air between us. Part of me wanted to say yes, to offer the olive branch that might begin healing our fractured family. But a larger part of me remembered the months of lies, the public humiliation, the way she tried to destroy not just my inheritance but my reputation and relationships. I'm not ready to forgive you, I said honestly. Maybe someday but not now. The wounds are too fresh, and I'm still dealing with the aftermath of everything you put in motion. Natasha nodded sadly. I understand. I hoped, but I understand. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, I think Dad made the right choice. You're doing exactly what he would have wanted with his legacy. I could never have built something like this. After she left, I sat in Dad's chair, my chair now, and thought about the conversation. There had been genuine remorse in Natasha's words, real recognition of the harm she'd caused. But there had also been something else, the same underlying sense of entitlement that had led to her crimes in the first place. She'd come asking for my help not because she understood that she owed me an apology, but because she needed something from me. Even in her remorse, she was still thinking about what I could do for her rather than what she could do to make amends. That realization solidified my decision. I wasn't going to write recommendation letters or help her find employment. She needed to rebuild her life through her own efforts, not through favors from the sister she tried to destroy. But I also wasn't going to spend my energy on resentment or revenge. Dad had left me something far more valuable than money, the opportunity to make a meaningful difference in people's lives. I wasn't going to let Natasha's poor choices diminish that gift. 6 months later, I received a brief email from Natasha. She and Cameron had moved to Atlanta as planned, and she'd found work at a nonprofit organization helping ex-offenders find employment. The pay was terrible, she wrote, but the work was meaningful in ways she'd never experienced before. I think I'm finally starting to understand what you and Dad saw in helping people, she concluded. It doesn't pay the bills very well, but it feeds something in me that chasing money never did. Maybe it's not too late for me to learn what really matters. I never responded to the email, but I kept it. Not as a step toward forgiveness, that might come someday or it might not. But as a reminder that people can change, that consequences can teach lessons, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and honoring the values of the people who believed in us. Dad's legacy lived on not in the sister who tried to steal it, but in the hundreds of people whose lives were better because of the empire he'd built and entrusted to someone who understood its true purpose. That was victory enough for me.